Get him, he's illegally transporting animals. Karen Whitfield's voice cut through the peaceful afternoon like a fire alarm, her perfectly manicured finger pointing at me as if I was some kind of fugitive. The sound of sirens shattered the tranquil evening and police lights bathed the fat carp jumping around in my truck bed in uneery blue glow. The entire neighborhood was staring at me like I just committed some heinous crime against their precious HOA, but they had no idea that what I'd just taken from that lake wasn't just a few fish. It was something this entire community depended on every single day. She just declared war on the one person who could turn this whole neighborhood into a desert with the flip of a switch. Stick around, Beckos. What happens next will blow your mind. Let me back up a bit. My name is Marcus Chen, and I was just trying to transport some carp from Clearwater Lake to my fish farm when all hell broke loose. It was a Thursday evening around 6 p.m. and I'd been looking forward to a quiet drive home with my new aquatic friends happily splashing in the back of my pickup. The lake sat right at the edge of Meadowbrook Estates, this upscale HOA community where every lawn looked like it belonged in a magazine and every mailbox was regulation beige. I'd been living there for 3 months now, having inherited my grandfather's old fish farm on the outskirts of the development. The transition from my corporate engineering job to rural fish farming had been surprisingly peaceful until today. I was securing the last water tank when I heard the commotion. Karen Whitfield, the HOA president and self-appointed guardian of community standards, was marching toward me with a small army of concerned residents trailing behind her. She was a woman in her 50s who dressed like she was perpetually heading to a board meeting, even when she was just prowling the neighborhood looking for violations. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a bun so tight it could probably stop bullets, and her expression suggested I'd just committed a capital offense. Behind her I could see the usual suspects: Janet Morrison, a 30-something yoga instructor who treated every neighborhood issue like a personal crisis, and Bill Hartwell, a retired veteran who'd been known to measure grass height with a ruler to ensure compliance. "Excuse me," Karen called out, her voice carrying that particular authority that only comes from years of telling people their garden gnomes are 2 and 2 tall. "What exactly do you think you're doing with those fish?" I noticed that one of my larger carp had managed to splash water all over itself and was now doing what could only be described as an enthusiastic belly dance in the tank, creating quite the spectacle for my growing audience. Another smaller carp seemed to be playing peekaboo with the onlookers, darting behind the filtration system every time someone got too close. The whole scene would have been comical if not for the genuine anger radiating from Karen's direction. I straightened up, wiping my hands on my jeans, and took a moment to collect myself. Growing up, my grandfather had always taught me that the best way to handle conflict was with patience and respect, even when the other person wasn't offering the same courtesy. "Good evening, Mrs. Whitfield. Just transporting some carp from the lake to my farm. I have all the proper permits if you'd like to see them." I reached into my truck's glove compartment and pulled out a folder containing my state fishing license, transportation permits, and aquaculture documentation. Everything was legal and above board, exactly as it should be. But Karen barely glanced at the paperwork before shaking her head with the kind of dramatic flair that would make a soap opera actress jealous. "Permits or no permits, this lake is part of our HOA community area. No one has the right to take anything from here without our explicit permission." Her voice was getting louder, and I noticed more neighbors gathering around us like we were some kind of street performance. Mrs. Dolores Rodriguez, a 70-year-old TikTok enthusiast who lived 2 houses down, was already holding up her phone and muttering, "Oh honey, what kind of drama is this? This is better than my stories." Janet Morrison was wringing her hands and looking genuinely distressed about the potential environmental implications, while Bill Hartwell stood with his arms crossed, clearly trying to tell us whether this situation required his military-trained intervention skills. That's when I heard the distinctive crackle of a police radio followed by Officer Rodriguez's familiar voice. "Dispatch, this is Rodriguez responding to another Karen situation at Meadowbrook." Over the radio squawked back with what sounded like barely suppressed laughter. "Copy that, Rodriguez. Good luck with that one. Try not to let her recruit you into the HOA board again." Officer Rodriguez was a tired-looking guy in his 40s who'd probably seen every possible HOA dispute in his 15 years on the force. As he climbed out of his patrol car, I heard him mutter under his breath, "I haven't even finished my coffee yet." "It's Karen again." The man clearly had extensive experience with this particular resident and her tendency to escalate minor issues into federal cases. He approached us with the weary patience of someone who'd broken up fights over unauthorized bird feeders, slightly to pink house paint, and the infamous Christmas lights in February incident that had divided the community for months. "All right, what seems to be the problem here?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew this was going to be one of those calls that would require more paperwork than actual police work. Meanwhile, my carp were putting on quits its show for their audience. The largest one, which I'd mentally nicknamed Houdini, had somehow managed to flip itself completely out of the tank and was now flopping around dramatically on the truck bed like it was auditioning for a role in a nature documentary. Karen immediately launched into her complaint, gesturing wildly at my truck like it contained stolen treasure or possibly weapons of mass destruction. "Officer, this man is removing wildly from our community lake without permission. This is theft of community resources, and I demand that you arrest him immediately." Her voice was reaching the kind of pitch that could probably shatter wine glasses while I quickly scooped Houdini back into the water, trying to maintain some dignity in what was rapidly becoming a Naples. Officer Rodriguez watched my fish rescue operation with the kind of professional interest that suggested seen stranger things during his career, though probably not many. He examined my permits with the thoroughness of someone who didn't want to file paperwork over fish transportation, turning each document over carefully and comparing signatures with the practiced eye of someone who'd learned to spot forgeries. After a few minutes that felt like hours, he handed them back to me with a nod that suggested both relief and mild amusement. "Everything looks legitimate here, ma'am. Mr. Chen has all the required documentation for legal fish transport, and as far as I can tell, he's operating within the bounds of state fishing regulations." But Karen wasn't having it. She crossed her arms and planted herself, like she was making a last stand at the Alamo, her face flushed with the kind of righteous indignation that comes from absolute certainty in one's moral superiority. "I don't care what his papers say, officer. This lake belongs to our HOA, and I'm telling you right now, no one takes anything from here without our explicit say-so." That's when I noticed something interesting that would stick with me for weeks to come. Karen was holding a water bottle with the Clear Water Springs logo, prominently displayed at the same crisp blue design that advertised water sourced from the very lake I'd just been fishing in. It struck him as oddly coincidental, but I filed that observation away for later consideration. There was something about their absolute certainty, her unwavering conviction that she controlled this lake and everything in it, that didn't quit it up with the reality of property law and water rights. The crowd was getting restless and you'd see several people filming with their phones, no doubt preparing to share this suburban drama with their social media followers within the hour. Karen seemed to thrive on the attention, raising her voice even more and turning to address the growing audience like she was delivering a campaign speech. "I'm telling all of you right now, I will not allow this man to steal from our community. I'll file a lawsuit if I have to, and I'll make sure he's permanently banned from this area." Her face was flushed with righteous indignation, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. She believed she was protecting something important, something that belonged to all of us. But the intensity of her reaction seemed disproportionate to the situation. Like there was something else driving her anger that had nothing to do with Fisher. Community resources. I looked at her for a long moment, then glanced at that Clear Water Springs bottle again, and finally at the lake that reflected the evening sky like a mirror. A slow smile spread across my face as pieces of a much larger puzzle began falling into place in my mind. There was a story here, a much bigger story than anyone ever, and Karen Whitfield was about to find out just how little she knew about the community she claimed to protect. "You know what, Mrs. Whitfield, I think we should have a private conversation sometime about property rights and ownership." The confidence in my voice seemed to catch her off guard, and I saw a flicker of uncertainty cross her features before the mask of authority slipped back into place. Officer Rodriguez was already walking back to his car, clearly done with this particular drama for the evening. But I could see him shaking his head with what looked like anticipation for whatever was coming next. But before I tell you why Karen Whitfield is about to apologize to me in front of the entire neighborhood, let me tell you where this story begins. 3 months earlier, when I'd first moved back to live on the farm I inherited from my grandfather, I thought the biggest challenge would be learning to tell the difference between a healthy carp and a sick one. I'd spent 30 years as a hydraulic engineer for a major water management company, designing systems that moved millions of gallons across state lines. That transition to small-scale fish farming seemed like it would be peaceful, almost meditative. I was looking forward to quiet mornings by the pond, watching the sunrise reflect off the water while my fish did whatever it is that makes fish. What I wasn't expecting was to find a treasure trove of legal documents that would completely change my understanding of this place. The discovery happened during my second week of cleaning out Grandpa's old workshop. I'd been putting off tackling his office area because, honestly, it felt like going through someone's private diary. The man had lived on this property for over 50 years, and every surface was covered with decades of accumulated textbook, fishing magazines, and hand-drawn sketches of pond improvements. I was sorting through a stack of old receipts when I noticed something odd about his desk. The bottom drawer seemed shorter than it should be, like there was a false bottom. Sure enough, when I pulled out the drawer completely, I found a hidden compartment containing an old metal lockbox that looked like it belonged in a 1950s bank vault. The lockbox was surprisingly heavy, and it took 20 minutes to find the key hanging on a rusty nail behind a faded photograph of my grandfather standing next to a much younger version of the lake. When I finally got it open, I found a collection of documents that had been carefully preserved in waterproof sleeves. The papers were yellowed with age, but still perfectly legible, and as I read through them, I felt like I was discovering a completely different version of my family history. These weren't just property deeds or insurance papers. These were water rights contracts, geological surveys, and legal agreements that painted a picture of my grandfather as someone who'd been far more strategic than I'd ever imagined. Sitting alone in that dusty office, holding a photograph of Grandpa standing proudly next to some kind of construction project, I felt a wave of emotion I wasn't prepared for. "Grandpa," I whispered to the empty room, "I had no idea what you sacrificed to secure all this. I promise, I won't let anyone destroy what you built." The photograph showed him as a young man, maybe in his 30s, wearing work clothes and standing next to what looked like the beginning stages of some kind of water management system. There were other men in the photo and heavy machinery in the background, but Grandpa was the one in charge of whatever project was happening. I knew I needed professional help understanding the legal implications of what I'd found. So, I called Jake Morrison, my old college roommate who'd become a real estate attorney. Jake had helped me with the inheritance paperwork when Grandpa passed, but I hadn't mentioned finding any additional documents. When he arrived the next morning, coffee in hand and reading glasses perched on his nose, he looked like he was expecting to review some boring property maintenance contracts. Instead, I watched his eyes get wider and wider as he read through page after page of my grandfather's carefully preserved legal arsenal. "Marcus, do you understand what you're holding here?" Jake asked, setting down a particularly thick contract, with the kind of reverence usually reserved for ancient manuscripts. "Your grandfather didn't just buy water extraction rights for this area. He purchased permanent control over the entire underground water supply for what's now Meadowbrook Estates. And look at this date, 1952. This contract predates the housing development by 40 years. He was getting excited in that way lawyers do when they find a legal loophole that could reshape an entire case. I could practically see the gears turning in his head as he calculated the implications. But the real bombshell came when Jake introduced me to Mrs. Betty Chen, my grandfather's firm bookkeeper, who was now 82 but still sharp as a tack. She lived in a senior community about 20 minutes away, and when Jake mentioned I was Henry Chen's grandson, she insisted on meeting me immediately. Mrs. Betty arrived at my farm the next afternoon, carrying a shoebox full of additional documents, and wearing the kind of smile that suggested she'd been waiting decades to tell someone a really good secret. "Your grandfather was the most careful man even knew," she said, settling into Grandpa's old recliner like she belonged there. "He didn't just buy water rights, sweetheart. He built the entire water filtration and distribution system that feeds every house in what became Meadowbrook Estates." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. According to Mrs. Betty, my grandfather had been approached in the early 1970s by developers who wanted to buy his land for a housing project. Instead of selling everything, he'd negotiated one of the most brilliant deals in local real estate history. He sold the surface rights to his property, but retained permanent ownership of all water rights and infrastructure for 99 years. The developers got their land, the homeowners got their houses. But my grandfather kept control of the one thing everyone needed: water. He used to tell me, Mrs. Betty continued with a crackle, that water was more valuable than gold because you can't live without it. Jake was practically bouncing in his chair as he cross-referenced the contracts with modern property records. "Marcus, this is extraordinary. The whole community was built on land your grandfather sold. But under the terms of these contracts, he retained complete control over their water supply. And since these are 99-year agreements signed in 1952, they don't expire until 201. He paused to let that sink in before adding, "Legally speaking, you don't just own a fish farm, you own the infrastructure that keeps 200 families' taps running." Jake's advice was crystal clear. "Keep this information confidential until the right moment. If you reveal this too early, they'll find ways to fight it. Let them make their moves first. Then you'll have the perfect timing to show your hand." It made sense from a strategic standpoint, but sitting on this kind of secret felt like carrying around a bomb. Every time I saw Karen Whitfield watering her pristine garden or washing her car in the driveway, I had to resist the urge to walk over and explain exactly who was making her suburban paradise possible. But I haven't told you the best part yet about why Karen had a very personal reason for wanting me gone. She wasn't just a randomly controlling HOA president. She was desperate. That morning after the fish thief incident, Karen had launched her underground campaign with the efficiency of a military operation. I woke up to find my phone buzzing with notifications from the Meadowbrook Estates Facebook page where Karen had posted a lengthy message about environmental contamination risks and unauthorized wildlife harvesting. The post was accompanied by photos she'd somehow managed to take of my fish tanks, complete with dramatic captions about unknown chemicals and potential health hazards to our community water supply. Within hours, the comment section had exploded into a full-scale neighborhood debate with Karen's supporters, expressing concern about their children's safety and a few brave souls questioning whether she might be overreacting just a tiny bit. But social media was just the beginning. By Tuesday, I'd received an official visit from the county veterinarian, responding to an anonymous complaint about unlicensed animal breeding operations. The poor guy seemed genuinely confused when I showed him my completely legal fish farming setup. complete with all the proper permits and health certificates. "I've got to be honest with you, Mr. Chen," he said, scratching his head as he watched my carp swimming peacefully in their well-maintained ponds. "This is one of the cleanest operations I've seen in years. Whoever filed this complaint either doesn't understand aquaculture or has some other agenda." He was professional enough not to name names, but we both knew exactly who had made that call. Karen's next move was to call an emergency home meeting for Friday evening, sending out urgent emails about protecting our community's safety and property values. The subject line read, "Immediate action required. Environmental threats in our neighborhood," which seemed a bit dramatic for a guy raising fish, but Karen had never been one for subtlety. I watched from my kitchen window as neighbors gathered in the community center, their faces serious with concern. The irony wasn't lost on me that they were meeting to discuss my supposed threat to their water supply while drinking the water that my grandfather's system provided to their homes. The community response was splitting into predictable factions. Karen's core supporters were mostly young families who'd moved to Meadowbrook for the safety and predictability of home living. They attended every meeting, followed every rule, and genuinely, we believed that Karen's strict oversight was what kept their property values high and their children safe. Then there was the neutral middle ground led by Harold Brennan, a retired plumber who'd been living in the neighborhood for 15 years. Harold had the kind of practical wisdom that comes from actually understanding how things work, and I'd noticed him giving me thoughtful looks whenever he passed by my property. Funny thing, he'd mentioned to his wife loud enough for me to hear. 30 years fixing pipes in this neighborhood, and the water system has never had a single major breakdown. Someone built it right the first time on my side. I had the unlikely support of Mrs. Dolores Rodriguez, who decided thought my fish drama was the most entertaining thing to happen in Meadowbrook since the great mailbox color controversy of 2019. She'd been posting TikTok videos about HOA Karen versus Fishman that were getting thousands of views, complete with her commentary about neighborhood politics. "Honey," she'd tell her phone camera while walking past my property, "that man's fish are cleaner than my kitchen," and Karen's acting like he's running a meth lab. Her support was unconventional but surprisingly effective at swaying public opinion among the younger residents. During my investigation into Karen's motivations, I'd started paying closer attention to the unusual amount of activity around certain houses in the neighborhood. Real estate signs would appear and disappear quickly, and I'd noticed several homes that seemed to be sitting empty despite appearing recently sold. When I casually mentioned this to Mrs. Betty during one of her visits, her face grew serious. "Marcus, I've been doing books for this community longer than most of these people have lived. Karen's been having a lot of meetings with people in expensive suits, and word is she owes the bank more than $1 million from her divorce last year." The pieces were starting to form a clearer picture of why Karen was so desperately trying to control every aspect of neighborhood life. My curiosity led me to follow Karen on a vanning when she left for what she'd announced as a community planning meeting. Instead of heading to City Hall, she drove to the Pinnacle Elopement offices downtown, where I watched her spend 2 hours in what looked like a very intense business discussion with a man in a $1,000 suit. Through the conference room windows, I could see charts and maps spread across the table, and both of them kept pointing toward what looked like aerial photographs of our neighborhood. When they finally shook hands, Karen's expression was a mixture of relief and determination that told me this wasn't just about HOA politics anymore. That night, I decided to try a different approach. Instead of hiding behind my permits and legal rights, I started making an effort to connect with my neighbors on a personal level. I began taking evening walks around the neighborhood, stopping to chat with people working in their gardens or walking their dogs. The conversations were revealing in ways I hadn't expected. Most people didn't care about me fish farming, and several admitted they thought Karen's reaction seemed overblown. "She's always been intense," one neighbor confided, "but lately she's been almost frantic about everything. Property values, community standards, and keeping outsiders away. It's like she's afraid of something." But just as I was starting to feel like I could work things out peacefully, Karen escalated the situation beyond anything I'd imagined. She wasn't satisfied with my quiet retreat from the lake. She wanted me gone entirely, and she was about to show me exactly how far she was willing to go to make that happen. What I discovered next would reveal that this was never really about fish or community standards. This was about money. Lots of it. And Karen had already made deals that put every single family in Meadowbrook Estates at risk. After playing the good neighbor for a week, I decided it was time to dig deeper into what was driving Karen's obsessive campaign against me. My evening walks had given me a better sense of the neighborhood index, but I still felt like I was missing crucial pieces of the puzzle. Karen's reaction to my fish farming seemed disproportionate, even by HOA standards, and her meeting with the Pinnacle development people had raised red flags I couldn't ignore. So, I did what any reasonable person would do when faced with a mystery that threatened their peaceful retirement plans. I started following people around like a suburban detective. My surveillance period began on a Tuesday evening when Karen left her house wearing what I'd come to recognize as her serious business outfit, a navy blazer that probably cost more than my monthly fish food budget. Instead of heading to of the usual HOA meeting locations, she drove straight to the Pinnacle Development headquarters, a gleaming office building that screamed expensive lawsuits and corporate takeovers. I parked across the street and watched as was escorted to a top-floor conference room where a man in an expensive suit was waiting with what looked like architectural plans spread across a massive table. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see Karen gesturing enthusiastically while the suit guy pointed at various sections of what appeared to be aerial photographs of our neighborhood. They had maps, charts, and what looked like financial projections, and both of them kept circling back to one particular area on the aerial view. It took me a moment to realize they were focusing on the exact location where my farm sat, right at the entrance to what would be prime real estate for any major development project. The meeting lasted nearly 2 hours, and when Karen finally emerged, she looked like someone who just signed a deal that would change her life forever. That's when I met Maria Santos, a local investigative journalist who had been tracking Pinnacle Development's activities for the past year. Maria had the kind of sharp, no-nonsense demeanor that comes from years of digging up stories that powerful people would prefer to keep. Pinnacle's been quietly buying up properties all over the county, she explained when I approached her about Karen's meetings. They use shell companies and local intermediaries to avoid attention, but the pattern is always the same. They identify communities with development potential, then work with local officials to create healthy conditions for forced sales. She showed me a folder full of documents that painted a disturbing picture of corporate manipulation and community destruction. According to Maria's research, Pinnacle had already purchased 30% of the homes in Meadowbrook Estates through various shell companies with names like Sunshine Property Holdings and Heritage Investment Group. The sales had been happening gradually, over the past 18 months, carefully spaced to avoid raising suspicions. Even more disturbing was the discovery that Karen had signed an exclusive consulting agreement with Pinnacle 6 months ago, promising her a $2 million bonus if she could convince 90% of the remaining residents to sell their homes within a 2-year time frame. The scope of the deception was staggering. Karen wasn't just trying to get rid of me because she disliked fish farming or worried about property values. She was systematically worked to destabilize the entire community to make way for a luxury resort development that would erase Meadowbrook Estates from existence. My farm wasn't just an obstacle to her plans, it was the keystone that could bring down the entire scheme, if she could force me out. The last major impediment to Pinnacle's resort project would be removed and Karen would be $2 million richer. Armed with this information, I started my own quiet counter-campaign. Instead of confronting Karen directly, I began having casual conversations with neighbors about the value of their properties and the suspicious number of recent sales in the area. I didn't mention Pinnacle or Karen's deal, but I planted seeds of curiosity that encouraged people to start asking their own questions. Have you noticed how many houses have sold lately? I'd ask while chatting over backyard fences. I wonder if some things driving up property values that we don't know about. The responses were telling. Many people had noticed that unusual sales activity, but hadn't connected the dots. The psychological pressure of carrying this secret was becoming overwhelming. Every time I saw Karen watering her perfect garden or chatting with neighbors about community activity, I felt like I was watching a performance designed to hide a massive betrayal. "Grandpa," I found myself saying to his photograph one evening, "protected this land for 50 years. Now it's my turn to protect the people who live on it." The weight of responsibility was heavier than I'd expected, but I was determined not to let Karen's greed destroy what my grandfather had spent his life building. But Karen wasn't done with me yet. She'd been monitoring my activities, and she'd noticed my increased engagement with the community. Her next move would be audacious, so completely beyond the bounds of normal HOA disputes that it would force me to reveal cards I'd been hoping to keep hidden. She was about to cross a line that would turn the entire neighborhood against her, but not before putting every single family in Meadowbrook Estates at risk. You might not believe this, but I, Marcus Chen, a hydraulics engineer living in this quiet, to a suburban community, had never imagined that a water rights dispute could take my life in this direction. Monday morning of the following week, I woke up to a silence that felt wrong somehow. It wasn't until I turned on the kitchen faucet and nothing came out that I realized what was missing. The familiar sound of water flowing through the pipes that had become the background soundtrack of suburban life. I tried the bathroom sink, the shower, even the outdoor spigot, but every tap in my house had gone completely dry. My first thought was that maybe there was a problem with my connection, but when I looked out the window, I could see neighbors standing in their driveways with confused expressions, holding empty coffee cups and looking like they just discovered that gravity had stopped working. Within an hour, the entire Estates community was in chaos. Families with young children were panicking about having no water for bottles or baths. The local coffee shop had to close because it couldn't operate its espresso machines. Mrs. Rodriguez was live streaming the crisis to her TikTok followers, walking around the neighborhood interviewing residents about their water emergency survival plans. Even the automatic sprinkler systems had shut down, leaving perfectly manicured lawns looking vulnerable and exposed in the morning sun. It was like watching a modern suburban community suddenly realize how dependent they were on the infrastructure they'd always taken for granted. Karen predictably had called an emergency HOA meeting for Venning, sending out mass emails with subject lines like water crisis. Immediate community response required urgent environmental contamination investigation. Her message was clear and damning. The water system failure was directly connected to my fish farming operation, and the community needed to take immediate action to protect their families from further contamination. She'd somehow managed to obtain official-looking documents suggesting that unauthorized aquaculture activities had introduced harmful bacteria into the water supply, requiring an emergency shut-in for public safety. The community center was packed that evening with nearly 200 residents, crowding into a space designed for maybe half that number. The atmosphere was tense and fearful, with parents holding sleeping babies and elderly residents looking genuinely worried about their health and safety. Karen stood at the front of the room like a general addressing troops before battle. Her presentation slides showing alarming statistics about waterborne diseases and environmental contamination. She'd prepared charts and graphs that seemed to prove my fish farming was the source of all their problems, complete with photographs of my property taken from angles that made everything look as suspicious as possible. "Ladies and gentlemen," Karen announced with the authority of someone who'd been preparing for this moment for months, "we are facing a crisis that threatens the health and safety of every family in our community. The evidence clearly shows that unauthorized activities on the Chen property have compromised our water supply." She clicked through slides showing bacteria levels, chemical readings, and regulatory violations that painted a picture of environmental disaster. The crowd was getting increasingly agitated, and I could see people starting to look at me with real anger instead of just mild annoyance. That's when Officer Rodriguez, who'd been standing quietly in the back of the room, stepped forward with information that changed everything. "Folks, I've been investigating this water situation, and there's something you need to know. The system wasn't damaged by contamination or bacteria. Someone hired a maintenance crew to work on the pipes last night, and they cut the main supply line. I've got the work order here, and it was paid for with HOA funds." He held up a stack of documents while the room fell silent. "The company that did the work, they were specifically instructed to cut the line that feeds the Chen property, but they ended up cutting the main trunk that supplies the entire neighborhood." The revelation sent shockwaves through the crowd. Karen's face went pale as Officer Rodriguez continued his explanation, but she recovered quickly and tried to maintain control of the narrative. "Even if there was a maintenance error, that doesn't change the fact that we're dealing with a serious environmental threat," she insisted, but her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. I could see people in the audience starting to exchange skeptical glances, and the mood was shifting from anger at me to confusion about Karen's role in the crisis. I knew this was my moment. I'd been holding back the truth for weeks, hoping to resolve things, but Karen had forced my hand by putting the entire community at risk. I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of every eye in the room, and asked Jake Morrison to join me at the front. He'd been sitting in the back with a projector and laptop waiting for exactly this scenario. "I think it's time Ivarian knew the real story about water rights in this neighborhood," I announced, and Jake began setting up the equipment while the crowd watched with growing curiosity. The documents we projected onto the screen told a story that nobody in that room had expected. The 1,952 contracts, the water rights agreements, the infrastructure ownership papers, all of it laid out in clear legal language that proved one undeniable fact. I wasn't just a resident of Meadowbrook Estates. I was the legal owner of the entire water supply system. Every drop of water that flowed through every pipe in the neighborhood came from sources that my grandfather had purchased and that he'd built. The 99-year contracts were ironclad, giving me complete control over water access until 201. "The reason your water was cut off," I explained to the stunned crowd, "wasn't because of anything I did to contaminate the system. It was because someone deliberately sabotaged the main line, hoping to blame me for the crisis." The room was dead silent as the implications sank in. Karen hadn't just been trying to get rid of me. She'd been willing to leave 200 families without water to accomplish her goals. Their betrayal was so complete, so callous, that people were starting to understand just how far she'd been willing to go. But Karen wasn't finished yet. She still had one last desperate card to play, and she was about to turn this community meeting into a battlefield that would determine the future of Meadowbrook Estates forever. The moment I finished explaining the water rights situation, Karen shot up from her chair like she'd been hit by lightning. Her face was flushed with a mixture of rage and desperation that made everyone in the room take a step back. The careful composed HOA president facade that she'd maintained for years was crumbling in real time, revealing someone who was cornered and fighting for survival. "You think you can fool these people with fake documents and lies?" she screamed, her voice echoing off the walls of the packed community center with a shrillness that made several children start crying. "This man is a fraud, a con artist who's been manipulating all of you with forged paperwork." The accusations came pouring out of her like water from a broken dam, each word more frantic than the last. She was gesturing wildly at the projected contracts, her hands shaking as she pointed at documents that bore official seals and legal signatures. I watched in fascination as Karen's desperation transformed her into someone I barely recognized. This wasn't the controlled, authoritative woman who'd been terrorizing the neighborhood for months. This was someone who'd been backed into a corner with no way out, and she was lashing out with everything she had left. Her perfectly styled hair was coming loose from its bun, and there were actual tears of frustration streaming down her face as she realized it thought her carefully constructed plan was falling apart in front of 200 witnesses. "Look at these electricity bills," she demanded, waving papers in the air like they were smoking guns. "Nobody uses this much power for legitimate fish farming. He's been running some kind of industrial operation, contaminating our water source, and now he's trying to cover it up with these fake contracts." The crowd was getting increasingly restless, with murmurs of confusion and concern rippling through the packed room like waves. I could see Janet Morrison whispering urgently to her husband about whether they should take their kids home, while Bill Hartwell was studying the projected documents with the analytic eye of someone who'd spent years reading military intelligence reports. Parents were pulling their children closer. Elderly residents were looking genuinely frightened about the possibility of being deceived by someone they'd trusted, and the teenagers in the back were filming everything with their phones, probably already planning their TikTok captions about HOA Karen's epic meltdown. Karen sensed the shift in mood and pressed her advantage with the desperation of someone who had nothing left to lose. She pulled out her phone with trembling fingers, claiming to have evidence that would prove everything she'd been saying. "I've been documenting everything," she announced, her voice cracking with emotion as she scrolled through photos and videos on her device. "This man has been lying to all of you from the beginning, and I have proof that he's been stealing water from our community for months. He's been running illegal operations, avoiding taxes, and now he's trying to steal our most precious resource with fake paperwork that probably cost him $50 to print at Kinko's." That's when Maria Santos, the investigative journalist who'd been quietly taking notes in the back corner, suddenly stood up and cleared her throat with the authority of someone who'd spent years exposing corruption. "Mrs. Whitfield, before you continue making accusations that could land you in legal trouble, perhaps the community would be interested in seeing some documents they'd have been investigating for the past 6 months. She pulled out her laptop and began connecting it to the projector system with practiced efficiency. "I've been researching Pinnacle Development's activities in this area, and I think Averian deserves to know the truth about who's trying to deceive this community." The room fell silent as Maris' evidence appeared on the screen, showing a very different picture of what had been happening in Meadowbrook Estates. The first document was a property acquisition map that looked like something from a military planning session, with our neighborhood marked in red zones and green zones, indicating which properties had been successfully purchased and which ones were still targets. Karen's face went white as she realized what was about to be revealed. But she was trapped in her chair, surrounded by angry residents who were finally about to learn the truth about their trusted HOA president. "This is Karen Whitfield's exclusive consulting agreement with Pinnacle Development," Maria announced, clicking to a document that showed Karen's signature on a contract, promising her a $2 million bonus for convincing 90% of residents to sell their homes. The room erupted in gasps and angry murmurs as people realized that their trusted HOA president had been working for a corporation that wanted to destroy their community. The betrayal was so complete, so calculated that several people stood up and started shouting questions at Karen, demanding to know how long she'd been lying to them. But Maria wasn't finished. She clicked through a series of property records that showed Pinnacle had already purchased 30% of the homes in the neighborhood through shell companies with names like Sunshine Holdings and Heritage Properties, and the fact that Karen had carefully hidden from the community during her 18 months off supposedly protecting their interests. Each new revelation hit the crowd like a physical blow, and I could see the anger building to a dangerous level as people realized just how comprehensively they'd been betrayed. "And here's the most damning evidence," Maria continued, her voice cutting through the chaos with professional calm. She pulled up a series of email exchanges between Karen and David Pinnacle, Jr. that read like a conspiracy thriller. The messages detailed their strategy for creating community instability to force reprisals, including specific plans to manufacture crises that would panic residents into selling their homes below market value. One email explicitly mentioned targeting the Chen property as the key obstacle and suggested creating public health concerns to justify removing me from the murdered neighborhood. The betrayal was so complete, so coldly calculated that the room fell into stunned silence as people absorbed the full scope of what had been done to them. Karen's response was pure, unadulterated desperation. She tried to discredit Maria's evidence, her voice arising to a near shriek as she claimed the emails were fabricated and the contracts were taken out of context. "You're all being manipulated by outside agitators who want to destroy our community," she shouted, but her voice was cracking with the strain of maintaining her story. "I've dedicated my life to protecting this neighborhood, and now you're going to believe some journalist and a man who's been lying to you about everything." She was gesturing frantically at the screen, trying to explain away documents that clearly showed her signature. her email address, and her systematic betrayal of the community she'd claimed to serve. Officer Rodriguez, who'd been in the back, stepped forward with the kind of authority that comes from years of dealing with criminals who have been caught red-handed. "Mrs. Whitfield, you might want to stop talking now. Anything you say from this point forward could be used against you in court." His words had the effect of a bucket of cold water on Karen's hysteria, and she suddenly realized that she wasn't just facing angry neighbors anymore. She was facing charges for fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. That's when I revealed the final piece of the puzzle, the evidence that would destroy any remaining sympathy for Karen's position. "You want to know what happened to your water supply?" I asked the crowd, pulling up one more document on the projector. "Karen didn't just hire a maintenance crew to cut my water line. She deliberately sabotaged the main trunk that supplies the entire neighborhood, knowing it would leave 200 families without water, including babies and elderly residents, just so she could blame me for the crisis." The work order was right there on the screen, paid for with HOA funds, and specifically designed to create the emergency that would justify my removal from the community. The revelation that Karen had been willing to deprive entire families of water, including young children and elderly residents who might have medical needs, just to accomplish her financial goals, was the final straw. The room exploded into angry shouts and demands for her immediate resignation, with parents particularly outraged that their children had been put at risk not by environmental contamination, but by the deliberate actions of someone they trusted. To protect them, people were standing up, pointing fingers, and calling for investigations into how much HOA money she'd spent on her schemes. And I could see that Karen was finally beginning to understand that there was no way out of this situation. But even as the crowd turned against her completely, Karen wasn't ready to surrender. She stood up one final time, her face streaked with tears and her voice breaking with emotion, and made one last desperate attempt to salvage her position. The woman who'd been presenting herself as the guardian of community values was about to show everyone exactly what those values were worth to her, and it wasn't going to be pretty. Just as the crowd was reaching peak outrage, demanding Karen's immediate resignation and threatening to involve law enforcement, the community center doors opened with a dramatic. David Pinnacle Jr. walked in wearing a perfectly tailored suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payments, his confident stride suggesting he was used to macking in trances that commanded attention. But instead of the arrogant, corporate executive I'd expected, his expression was serious, almost apologetic as he approached the front of the room where Karen was still trying to maintain control of the rapidly deteriorating situation. "Ladies and gentlemen," David announced, his voice carrying the kind-of authority that comes from years of boardroom negotiations, "I'm David Pinnacle Jr. and I'm here to inform you that Pinnacle Development is immediately withdrawing from all planned projects in this area." The room fell silent as people tried to process this unexpected development. Karen's face went through a series of expressions from confusion to hope to dawning horror as she realized that her corporate ally was about to abandon her completely. "After reviewing the situation with our legal team, we've determined that we received fundamentally incomplete information about property rights and community dynamics in this neighborhood." David's revelation was like watching a master chess player sacrifice his queen to win the game. "The truth is, we've known about Mr. Chen's water rights since the beginning of our preliminary research. Our environmental impact team identified 1,952 contracts during our initial due diligence process." He gestured toward the projected documents that were still glowing on the screen. "What we didn't know was that our local consultant had been deliberately withholding this information while simultaneously creating artificial crises to manipulate values. Mrs. Whitfield's methods were not only unethical, they were potentially illegal, and Pinnacle Development cannot be associated with such practices." The corporate betrayal was swift and surgical. David explained that Karen had been presenting herself as someone who could deliver the community's cooperation, but her deception had put Pinnacle at legal risk and damaged their reputation. Frankly, he continued with the kind of cold professionalism that probably made him very good at his job. "We allowed Mrs. Whitfield to dig her own grave while we quietly gathered evidence of her misrepresentation. This gave us legal grounds to terminate our agreement without penalty, saving our company from a project that was compromised from theft." Karen was staring at him with the expression of someone who just realized they'd been played by a master. The vote to remove Karen from her position as HOA president was swift and overwhelming. Out of nearly 200 residents present, only 12 voted to keep her in office. And most of those were probably just confused about the voting process. The margin was so decisive that there was no question about the community's judgment of her actions. People were standing up to voice their anger about the betrayal, the wasted HOA funds, and the deliberate endangerment of families with young children. Harold Brennan, the retired plumber who'd been skeptical of Karen's claims from the beginning, was unanimously elected as the new HOA president, promising transparency and common-sense leadership. But even in the face of complete defeat, I felt compelled to offer Karen something that she'd never shown to anyone else: compassion. looking at this woman who'd been so desperate to save herself from financial ruin that she'd been willing to destroy an entire community. I realized that her actions came from fear rather than pure malice. "Mrs. Whitfield," I said, stepping closer to where she sat slumped in her chair, "I understand you've been facing serious financial difficulties. That is what you did, but it helps explain why you felt you had no other choice." The room was quiet as people watched this moment of grace in the midst of their justified anger. I made a proposal that surprised everyone, including myself. "I won't pursue legal action against you for the property damage or the misuse of HOA funds, but I have two conditions. First, you need to make a public apology to this community for betraying their trust and endangering their families. Second, you need to work with Harold to ensure that every penny of HOA money you spent on your schemes is accounted for. And, where possible, return to the community fund." Karen looked up at me with tears in her eyes, nodding slowly as she realized that I was offering her a way out that was far more generous than anything she deserved. The practical work of restoring the community began immediately. I had the water system back online within 2 hours, using backup connections that my grandfather had installed decades earlier for exactly this kind of emergency. The relief on people's faces as they heard water flowing through their pipes again was worth all the drama we'd been through. Harold proved to be an excellent choice for HOA president, approaching problems with the practical wisdom of someone would fix things with his own hands rather than just complaining about them at meetings. Mrs. Dolores Rodriguez appointed herself as the neighborhood's unofficial social media coordinator, creating TikTok videos that explained the entire situation to the outside world while celebrating the community's victory over corporate manipulation. Her videos went viral, turning our small neighborhood drama into a national conversation about HOA overreach and corporate greed. "Honey," she told her followers while standing in front of my fish ponds, "this is what happens when good people stand up to bullies with briefcases." I kept my promise to turn the fish farm into an education for the community. Children from the neighborhood started coming by after school to learn about aquaculture and water conservation, and several families began volunteering to help with pond maintenance. Clearwater Lake was officially designated as a community conservation, the area with educational signs explaining its history and the transformation from a source of conflict to a source of community pride happened remarkably quickly once people understood the real story. True to her word, Karen left Meadowbrook Estates within 2 months, relocating to another state to start. Over 6 months later, I received an email from her that was both surprising and oddly touching. "Marcus," she wrote, "I want to apologize again for everything I put you and the community through. I found a job with a non-profit organization that helps communities protect their water resources, and I think about the lessons I learned from a conflict every day. Thank you for showing me that there was a better way to handle my problems than destroying their people's lives." Sitting by the lake on a quiet evening, watching my fish swim peacefully in water that my grandfather had fought to protect, I reflected on how much had changed in such a short time. The community that had once viewed me with suspicion now treated me as a neighbor and friend, and the water that had been a source of conflict had become a symbol of cooperation and shared responsibility. Sometimes the most valuable thing isn't power or money, but the respect and trust of the people around you, earned through integrity and defended with courage. Tired of watching bullies win while good people suffer. I get it, that helpless rage, when someone with a little power thinks they own everyone around them. If you like this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Alex Stories.